It all began on what should have been a peaceful Saturday morning. The sun was just starting to rise over the tree line, casting a golden shimmer across the calm water. Birds were chirping, a few fish jumped now and then, and the soft lap of the lake against my boat was about as close to perfect serenity as a person could get. I was leaning against the railing on the deck of my boat, coffee mug in hand, savoring the gentle breeze that carried the earthy scent of pine mixed with fresh water. It was one of those mornings that made all the long hours at work feel worth it. When life seemed simple and good, that was until I heard the sound of determined footsteps crunching along the gravel path by the shore. It was too crisp, too purposeful to belong to a jogger or someone out for a leisurely morning stroll. I didn't even have to look to know trouble was approaching. Sure enough, when I glanced over my shoulder, there she was, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tight you'd think smiling was a crime. Her name was Deborah, the newly minted head of the local HOA, and she strutted like she owned every blade of grass in the entire community. I took another slow sip of my coffee and waited for the inevitable, "Excuse me, sir." Her voice rang out sharp and shrill, slicing through the quiet like a rusty knife. She paused at the edge of the dock, squinting up at me, as though trying to figure out how to approach this delicate matter of confrontation. I could almost see her running through her mental script, rehearsing the lines she'd probably practiced in front of her bathroom mirror that morning, yes? I replied, doing my best to keep my expression neutral. It wasn't that I disliked people. I just disliked people who came armed with clipboards and smug authority, thinking they could dictate terms on a whim. She cleared her throat, gave a quick tug at the hem of her HOA-issued polo shirt, and then launched in her monologue. "I'm afraid you can't have this boat parked here. It violates several community guidelines regarding the use of common water resources. As a resident, you're required to remove it within 72 hours or face fines. It's all clearly outlined in the bylaws you agreed to when you moved here." I couldn't help but let out a short laugh, which seemed to annoy her even more. The way her nose twitched and her fingers drummed impatiently on her clipboard told me she'd been hoping for immediate compliance, maybe even an apology, followed by me scrambling to untie the lines and motor my boat away like some guilty trespasser. Instead, I leaned casually against the railing, swirling what was left of my coffee around the mug, and let the moment stretch. The silence made her uncomfortable, which was precisely the point. Finally, I spoke. "You're right. It's always good to follow the rules. But I think you might be mistaken about who's responsible for this lake." Her eyebrows shot up. That wasn't in her script. She blinked twice, obviously trying to regroup, then pressed on with forced politeness. "Sir, it's all very clear in the HOA documentation. This lake is part of our shared community resources. Your boat is in violation of our aesthetic standards, as well as—" "That's funny," I interrupted, "because according to the county land records and the deeds filed with the assessor's office, this lake is actually private property." My private property. For a split second, she looked like a fish gasping for air. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. The words were gone, sucked right out of her by the weight of what I'd just dropped on her carefully organized world. I almost felt bad. Almost. "You see," I continued, tapping the railing of my boat for emphasis, "when I bought this place, I didn't just buy the house up on the hill. I purchased the entire parcel, which includes this lake, the dock, and everything beneath the waterline. So technically, you're standing on my dock right now, which means you're the one who needs my permission to be here." The expression on her face was priceless. It cycled through confusion, embarrassment, then landed squarely on indignation as she struggled to regain her footing. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard, as if hoping some hidden clause would magically appear to save her. Her pen scratched nervously against the forms, her eyes darting over words that suddenly seemed far less authoritative. I waited, silent and patient, watching her come to terms with the realization that her HOA power ended exactly where my property lines began. When I first moved into this lakeside community, I thought I was buying into a quiet, peaceful life. A place where I could unwind after long days, cast a line into the water whenever I wanted, and watch the sun sink behind the trees with nothing but the gentle hum of crickets to keep me company. For a while, it was exactly that, my little slice of heaven. until the HOA decided it was their mission to police every inch of the neighborhood, right down to the color of mailboxes and how often people trim their hedges. I mostly ignored them, paid my dues, nodded politely at meetings, and went about my life. Then came a morning they decided my boat was a problem. It was just after dawn when I first spotted the little convoy rolling down the private drive that led to my property. 3 SUVs, each one sporting a bright magnetic HOA emblem slapped across the doors like a sheriff's badge. They parked in a neat line by my gate, and out stepped a small army of clipboard warriors, led by a woman named Linda. She was the type who wore her hair pulled so tight it looked like it hurt, with a permanent scowl carved into her forehead. You could practically smell the scent of cheap authority wafting off her. I watched them from my porch for a moment, coffee steaming in my hand, before deciding I'd let them come to me. No point in appearing too eager. They marched right up my walkway, as if they owned the place, didn't even pause to knock, just started taking photos of my boat tied up along the dock. Linda turned to her little crew, whispering something that made 2 of them giggle. Then she cleared her throat and called up to me with that syrupy, sweet tone people use right before they drop a hammer. "Good morning. We're just here to perform a quick compliance inspection. Looks like there's an issue with the boat moored on the lake. It's unfortunately out of line with our community standards." I raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip before answering. "Is that right? And what standards would those be?" She tapped her clipboard like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Our bylaws are very clear about maintaining a uniform appearance across all visible properties. Boats must either be stored off-site or kept in HOA-approved marinas. Yours is an eyesore. It disrupts the aesthetic harmony of our lakeshore. You'll need to remove it within 48 hours to avoid penalties." The smugness in her voice was enough to make anyone's blood boil, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I leaned against the porch railing, taking in the way the morning light glinted off the water. "Interesting. I don't remember seeing anything in your handbook about my lake." She blinked, thrown off for just a second, then recovered. "Sir, it's not your lake. This is a shared amenity of the community. It's under HOA jurisdiction, which means it's subject to our regulations." I actually laughed at that, a deep belly laugh that made 2 of her clipboard carriers exchange uneasy looks. "Linda, was it? Let me help clear something up. This lake is not a shared amenity. When I bought this property, it included the entire lake and surrounding wetlands. It's all on my deed, right there with my name printed in bold letters. If you'd like, I can fetch the paperwork and we can go through it together, line by line." The way her face twisted was almost entertaining. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits, mouth pulled so tight it nearly disappeared. She flipped through her own documents, scanning pages that clearly didn't say what she'd hoped. One of her underlings whispered something in her ear, probably a question she didn't want to answer because she waved them off like flies. I stayed quiet, just letting the weight of my words settle in around them. The longer the silence stretched, the redder her face became. Finally, she managed to squeak out, "Well, regardless, your boat is unsightly. The community expects a certain level of presentation. Perhaps you could still move it somewhere less visible for the sake of neighborly cooperation." I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. "Tell you what, Linda, I'll keep your suggestion in mind. Meanwhile, you and your team are technically trespassing on private property. So unless you'd like me to involve the county sheriff to help explain property boundaries, I suggest you take your clipboards and go discuss HOA bylaws somewhere you actually have jurisdiction." Her mouth opened, ready to protest, but nothing came out. She stood there a moment longer, eyes darting between her silent entourage, the sparkling lake, and me still calmly sipping my coffee. Then, with a huff that sounded more embarrassed than authoritative, she turned on her heel and stomped back toward the SUVs, her little flock scuttling after her. I watched them retreat, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and exactly what you own. I'd always known living by a lake would draw some attention, but I never guessed it would be from the people who claim to run the community. When I first moved into this place, I was drawn by the peace, the open water, the way the fog rolled in the early mornings and wrapped everything in a hushed stillness that made you feel like the only person in the world. I spent countless hours fishing off my small deck, reading in a hammock strung between two sturdy pines, or just sitting on the dock watching dragonflies dance over the water's glassy surface. For a while, life was as close to perfect as I figured a man could hope for. That illusion lasted until the HOA decided to stick their noses where they didn't belong. It started with a letter. A heavy, official-looking envelope tucked inside my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's neat little logo and addressed in rigid block letters that suggested someone had a bit too much fun with their label maker. I opened it standing right there by the road, letting the paper flutter in the gentle breeze. The letter was a standard form, full of polite phrasing that didn't quite cover the underlying threat. According to them, my boat, tied up alongside my dock like it had been since I moved in, was in violation of their so-called community aesthetic. It was too large, too visible, and apparently didn't match the natural harmony they insisted was the standard for waterfront properties. They wanted it gone within 10 days, or I'd start racking up fines that could eventually turn into liens on my property. I couldn't help but shake my head at the absurdity. That boat had been my dream long before I bought this land. I'd saved for years to get it. A modest cabin cruiser that let me explore the far corners of the lake, sometimes even spend the night rocked to sleep by gentle waves. It was more than just a vessel. It was a symbol of what I'd worked for, a tiny floating refuge. The thought that someone with a clipboard and a rulebook could order me to get rid of it was laughable. Or it would have been if they hadn't seemed so dead serious. A few days later, I heard tires crunching along my private drive. I looked out the window and spotted a pair of SUVs, gleaming in the afternoon sun, parked just outside my gate. Out stepped three people, all wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA crest, clipboards tucked under their arms like weapons. They let themselves through the gate, my gate, without so much as ringing the bell. I watched them from the porch, arms folded, as they made their way down toward the water, snapping pictures of my boat from every angle like it was some crime scene they were building a case around. One of them finally approached me, a woman with tight blonde curls and sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She introduced herself as Karen, which was almost too perfect, and started rattling off bylaw numbers and page references as if reciting poetry. Her voice dripped with forced courtesy, each sentence ending with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. According to her, the boat's placement was disrupting the view for other residents, lowering property values, and potentially harming local wildlife, though she didn't seem to know exactly how. I listened patiently, let her finish her little speech, then simply said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She blinked, caught off guard, then recovered with a patronizing chuckle. "Oh no, there's no misunderstanding. The HOA governs all properties within the subdivision, including lake usage. It's spelled out clearly in the charter you should have received when you moved in." That's when I decided to educate her. I pulled out my own file, a thick folder I kept in my study, stuffed with surveys, deeds, and county records. Handed her a copy of the plat map that showed exactly where my property lines were. Her eyes darted over the page, confusion creeping in as she realized the lake, every last acre of it, sat entirely inside my parcel. It wasn't a shared amenity. It wasn't community land. It was private, mine alone, purchased outright with my own hard-earned money. Her lips moved, trying to shape words that wouldn't come, until finally she gave a tight nod and motion for her clipboard crew to follow her back to their vehicles. I stood on the porch watching them go, the sound of gravel under their feet oddly satisfying. Their shoulders were a little more slumped on the way out, their clipboards held a bit lower, like shields that had failed them. I turned back to the lake, where the sun was just beginning to dip low, casting the water in molten gold, and smiled at the thought that no HOA rulebook was ever going to take this away from me. I remember the first time I saw the property. It was early spring. The trees just started to show the first tender green leaves, the air cool and smelling of damp earth. The real estate agent had driven me down a winding gravel road that seemed to go on forever, twisting through dense woods until finally it opened up to reveal a wide, sparkling lake, still and perfect as a sheet of glass. The house was nice enough, a sturdy lodge-style place with broad porches and big windows, But it was the lake that sealed the deal for me. I knew right then I had to have it. The thought of owning not just a house by a lake, but the lake itself, to fish, to boat, to watch the seasons change across its surface in total peace, felt like something out of a dream, so I bought it. I signed a mountain of paperwork, transferred what felt like a lifetime's worth of savings, and moved in within a month. For a long time, it was everything I hoped. My mornings were filled with bird song and the gentle lap of water against my dock. Evenings brought glorious sunsets that painted the lake in fire and honey. Sometimes I'd sit out on my boat with a rod in hand, not really caring if I caught anything, just drifting and letting the water rock me into a kind of meditative calm. It was the kind of life people write novels about, or spend decades yearning for, and I counted myself lucky every single day. Then the HOA decided they had business with me. It started innocently enough. A newsletter stuffed into my mailbox with reminders about upcoming meetings and reminders to keep lawns neat. I tossed it aside. I didn't mind paying my dues or living alongside some rules if it meant the road stayed paved and the neighborhood didn't turn into a junkyard. But it wasn't long before the tone shifted. Next came a polite but firm letter pointing out that my boat, which I kept tied up neatly in my own dock, might not be in compliance with community visual standards. They wanted me to relocate it or risk fines. At first, I thought it had to be a misunderstanding. Surely they knew the lake was private, part of my property, beyond the HOA's reach. A week later, two men in tucked-in polos and khaki shorts showed up unannounced. They knocked on my door holding clipboards, all businesslike smiles and fake neighborly charm. They introduced themselves as members of the HOA's compliance committee and said they were there to conduct a visual assessment of the lakeshore. Before I could say much, they were walking around my yard, pointing and whispering, scribbling notes. One even leaned out over my dock to snap photos of my boat, like it was a crime scene. When they finally came back up the path, they handed me a printed notice. It claimed my boat violated multiple bylaws and gave me 30 days to either remove it or face escalating penalties, starting with hefty daily fines and eventually moving toward legal action. I could tell by the way they handed it to me, with satisfied little smirks, that they expected me to fold right then, and there I didn't. Instead, I invited them in for coffee. They hesitated, maybe thrown off by my calm, but eventually accepted. We sat at my kitchen table, the lake framed in the window behind me, and I let them go on about their guidelines and regulations, nodding politely, even offering them muffins left over from breakfast. When they finally wound down, I got up, went to my study, and returned with a thick folder of documents. I laid out the original survey maps, the property deed, the county zoning letters, all stamped and certified. It didn't take long for the color to drain from their faces. My property extended well beyond the house and lawn, encompassing the entire lake itself. The water, the dock, even the trees lining the far shore. It all belonged to me. Their HOA bylaws had no jurisdiction here. They could dictate mailbox colors and fence heights on the streets around me. But they couldn't tell me what to do with my own private lake. One of them stammered an apology, eyes darting back and forth over the documents, clearly trying to find some loophole that didn't exist. The other just stared out the window at my boat, realization sinking in. When they left, they were much quieter than when they arrived. Their confident clipboards held a little closer to their chests. I watched them drive off down my long gravel road, disappearing back toward the parts of the neighborhood where their rules still meant something. And then I poured myself another cup of coffee, walked down to the dock, and sat on my boat, perfectly content in the knowledge that this lake, and everything on it, was entirely my own. I'd gotten used to early mornings by the lake, when a mist hovered just above the water and the world felt hushed and private. It was the kind of peace I'd always dreamed of. No traffic noise, no neighbors peeking over fences, just the gentle sound of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon. Most days I'd wander down the path with a mug of coffee, step out onto the dock, and take a seat on my boat just to watch the sunlight climb over the treetops. It was a ritual that reminded me why I'd worked so hard, saved every penny, and eventually bought this patch of paradise. I never imagined it would become the center of a power struggle, with people who thought a clipboard and a set of rules gave them dominion over everything in sight. It began on a Wednesday, right after I got back from a week-long trip to see family. There was a neat little envelope taped to my front door, sealed with a bright sticker that bore the HOA's official logo. Inside was a letter full of cheerful greetings and overly formal language that barely masked the threat underneath. It informed me that during a recent routine visual survey, my boat had been deemed non-compliant with the community's visual cohesion standards. According to them, it obstructed the natural sight lines from nearby homes and disrupted the carefully cultivated aesthetic they claimed to maintain. They wanted it moved within 14 days, or I'd face daily fines that would keep climbing until I complied. I stood on my porch reading that letter twice, feeling a slow simmer of irritation build with each line. It was my lake, my dock, my boat, all sitting on property I owned outright. Nobody from the HOA had ever so much as asked permission to step onto this land, yet here they were dictating what I could do with it. I decided it had to be a misunderstanding. Surely once they realized the lake wasn't part of the community's shared amenities but privately owned, they'd back off. So I drafted a polite email, attached copies of my property maps and deed, and sent it off expecting that would be the end of it. A few days later, I heard the rumble of engines in the driveway. I looked out to see two SUVs crawling up the gravel, both sporting shiny magnetic signs that bore the HOA's emblem like a badge of authority. Out stepped three people in matching polo shirts, clipboards at the ready, faces set in expressions of polite condescension. The one in front introduced himself as Brad, the HOA's compliance officer, and immediately started in on a speech about preserving neighborhood standards and protecting property values. He hardly took a breath as he recited bylaw numbers and cited examples of other residents who had willingly altered their landscaping or removed unsightly structures to stay in line with the board's vision. When he finally paused, I handed him the same documents I'd emailed days earlier. The property line map was highlighted in bright yellow, making it painfully clear that not only did I own my house and lawn, I owned the entire lake as well, right down to the deepest muddy bottom. Brad's eyes moved over the page, his confident smile faltering just a touch, but he quickly masked it. He flipped through to the next sheet, then the next, looking for something, anything that might give the HOA the authority to tell me what to do. The other two hovered behind him, whispering under their breaths, trying to make sense of paperwork that completely undercut their mission. Brad cleared his throat, trying to regain the upper hand. He said that even if the lake itself was privately owned, the view of it still affected neighboring lots, and that under certain interpretations of the bylaws, the board could exercise influence to preserve what he called community enjoyment. I had to bite back a laugh. It was such a flimsy stretch. I could see even he didn't fully believe it. I told him calmly that unless their bylaws were somehow superior to state property law, he was free to test that theory in court. I'd be happy to bring my stack of surveys, deeds, and tax records to any judge they could find that seemed to drain the last of the certainty from his face. The three of them huddled for a moment, speaking in low voices that didn't quite carry, then finally snapped their clipboards shut and offered stiff nods. They trudged back to their SUVs without another attempt at argument. I watched them drive off down my long gravel lane, disappearing around the bend with their bright HOA logos shrinking from view. I stood there for a long moment after they were gone, the sun warming my shoulders, the lake sparkling behind me exactly as it always had, untouched and entirely mine. When I first settled into this lakeside retreat, I thought I'd finally discovered a piece of the world that could stay untouched by petty squabbles and power games. It was the kind of place you dreamed about while stuck in traffic or grinding through endless hours at a desk, a sanctuary surrounded by towering pines that whispered when the breeze passed through, with a wide, tranquil lake at its center that seemed to reflect a different, quieter universe. The mornings here were almost sacred. I'd wake before sunrise, brew a strong cup of coffee, and carry it down to the dock where my boat waited, gently nudging against the pilings as if eager to slip free into the water. Those were the moments that made every long day of work, every sacrifice I'd made to buy this property, feel absolutely worth it. It stayed blissfully simple until the HOA decided my life needed rearranging. It was almost comical at first, a glossy trifold flyer tucked into my mailbox with smiling stock photo neighbors on the front, welcoming me to a vibrant, coordinated community. I chuckled, tossed it on the counter, and didn't give it second thought. But a few weeks later, another letter arrived, this one on heavy letterhead embossed with the HOA seal, informing me of an upcoming neighborhood inspection. According to them, it was a routine check to ensure compliance with community visual standards. I didn't think much of it. I kept my place neat, the dock was in good repair, the boat was clean and well-maintained. What could they possibly find fault with the day of the inspection dawned clear and warm? I was down on the dock, replacing a cleat that had started to work loose when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking up, I spotted two dark SUVs pulling in, each sporting magnetic HOA logos on their doors. Out stepped a cluster of people dressed in khakis and matching embroidered polos, clipboards already in hand, eyes scanning my property like predators sizing up prey. Their leader was a sharp-faced woman named Carol, who introduced herself with a smile so tight it seemed painful, then immediately began pointing out various areas of concern. To her colleagues, they strutted around my yard, taking photos and muttering to each other while I finished up my repairs, deliberately taking my time. Eventually, Carol made her way down to the dock, high heels clicking awkwardly against the weathered boards, and peered at my boat as though it offended her deeply. She cleared her throat and launched into a speech about how the HOA was committed to maintaining uniform aesthetics around the lake, and how boats tied up at private docks could diminish the view from other homes, lower property values, and set a troubling precedent. Her voice dripped with patronization, as if she were explaining all this to a wayward teenager rather than the actual owner of the land. She stood on. I listened patiently until she finished, then told her quite calmly that the lake, the dock, and the stretch of land they were all standing on weren't under HOA jurisdiction. I explained that when I bought the property, it included not only the house and yard, but the entire lake itself, water, bed, and banks. I even offered to fetch the deed and survey records to clear up any confusion. Carol's polite smile slipped for just an instant before she snapped back into her official posture. She insisted the HOA had broad authority to enforce community standards on anything that impacted the shared environment, and that my boat's presence was undeniably disruptive to the harmonious view the board worked so hard to protect. I had to laugh at that. The idea that her committee's aesthetic preferences could override county records and state property law was absurd. I told her as much, in the most courteous tone I could manage. Her jaw tightened, and she shifted her weight, clearly not used to being challenged. She promised they'd be following up with formal notices, possibly even legal avenues if I refused to comply. I just nodded and told her to do what she felt necessary. In the meantime, unless she had a court order or a sheriff's deputy with her, she and her entourage were trespassing on private property. They didn't leave right away. There was more quiet conferring, some frustrated muttering, even a few annoyed glances thrown my way. Eventually, Carol gathered her group with a clipped wave, and they retreated up the path to their waiting SUVs, their clipboards hugged tight like shields. I watched them disappear back down the driveway, swallowed up by the trees, while the lake behind me glistened under the afternoon sun exactly as it always had, still and untouched by anyone's rules but mine.